Greetings, Goyim. The other day at the gym, a friend of mine mentioned the new Avatar film and joked that it was Dances with Wolves in Space Part 2. I had heard this comparison made about the first film over 10 years ago, so I didn't really remember it, and it gave me a chuckle. And then I saw another creator here on YouTube refer to it as Space Pocahontas 2, which is again apt and humorous, and this kind of got me thinking about why people in modern society are so obsessed with this sort of romantic primitivism. And then it occurred to me that romantic primitivism is popular among people on the dissident right and those who we would probably consider to be our mortal enemies, which I think makes it sort of unique and worth unpacking and analyzing a little bit further. Many people probably understand what is meant by romantic primitivism, even if they've never heard the specific academic term for it. But it's basically a subset of romanticism that suggestively portrays the lifestyles of pre-modern or primitive peoples as uncorrupted and natural, and therefore morally superior in some way. But it can also easily manifest itself to what amounts to a kind of unintentionally patronizing idealistic fantasy wherein pre-modern societies are falsely portrayed as being innocent and childlike, living in some kind of utopian harmony with nature before they were corrupted by their interactions with cultures that are more technologically advanced. And this is what is commonly referred to as the noble savage trope or theme. And this theme is what's kind of clumsily interwoven into both Dances with Wolves and Avatar. In both of these films, the writers and producers implanted these absurdly negative stereotypes of white Americans as these sadistic, imbecilic villains that have absolutely no humanity or redeeming qualities whatsoever. They're intended as archetypes, but come off as caricatures of evil and corruption, which are starkly contrasted by the indigenous characters, which are intended to be archetypes of virtue and purity. So, the message there is pretty clear. I've seen some critics claim both of these films are examples of the white savior trope, but in reality, these films are actually more poignant examples of the noble savage trope. And the reason is pretty clear. It's because both of these films aren't portrayals of white men coming and saving some innocent savages with our superior ways. In both of these types of films, the white main character becomes enamored with a foreign people and their culture and completely integrates into what's portrayed as a more primitive yet superior culture, while simultaneously he abandons and even violently resists his own culture, which is always portrayed as more advanced, but only in superficial technical ways, not spiritual or moral ones. So I guess if we want to get a good idea of why romantic primitivism is such a common theme in modern art, we need to first think about the root psychological motivator for the creators of this content. What's clear is no matter who these people are or what worldview they hold, the inclusion of romantic primitivism is an expression of deep dissatisfaction with modern culture. Artists who realize that this feeling of dissatisfaction, this kind of emptiness that they feel with modern society, they realize that it's very common. And thus the insertion of romantic primitivist themes is very relatable and appealing for all sorts of people who live in highly modernized societies. But what I think that these liberal leftist cultural elites like James Cameron don't seem to understand, or perhaps they're just incapable of admitting, is that the dissatisfaction that they're feeling is a direct result of what modernity lacks and what primitivity has in droves. which is namely simplicity, purity, and authenticity, and spiritually enriching experiences. And the lifestyles that these liberal leftist types promote and defend are completely at odds with the primitivism that they romanticize. The cultural elites and their brainwashed foot soldiers are psychologically and emotionally geared to promote and defend the antitheses of the primitive lifestyle, which are things like decadence and secularism and atheism and liberalism and Marxism and cosmopolitanism, etc. As hard as they try, the hollow void that results from their vapid modern lifestyle can't really be filled with their outrageously overpriced material goods and their trendy, purebred pets and their decadent bourgeois cuisine. So while they desperately want to express to the world that modernity is soul-sucking, they can't, because they are ironically the vanguard of modernity itself. So the reality of what they're feeling can't really be squared with the tenets of their dogma. So they believe both and willfully fail to see a contradiction. So imagine for a moment this kind of low-T urbanite bugman who works in a cubicle at some tech firm and lives in a studio apartment and has really never known a hard day's labor in his entire life. He encourages everyone to get the jab and lives in the pod and eats the bugs, and he spends most of his day on social media trying to shit on right-wing survivalists or ethno-nationalists who seek to reverse modernity. One weekend, the bugman goes on a trip to the nearest national park, and he walks out in the wilderness and gets his heart pumping. He breathes the fresh air and feels his blood and perhaps whatever testosterone is left in his body coursing through his veins. The sunlight feels wonderful on his back, and he feels at peace, almost like he's in a sort of sanctuary. It's a spiritual experience for him. When he goes back to his meaningless, decadent, cosmopolitan existence, he feels a deep depression, but he can't really explain why. He longs for that spiritual experience once again, but confoundingly, to help him cope with his depression, the bugman instinctually goes right back on social media and starts railing on the same people who are criticizing modernity and the liberal world order. The same bugman might go to a Christmas market and sense the beauty of such an event as he hears a choir singing carols, but he'll never be able to admit that it's something old, something traditional, that makes all of these things idealistic and special, because that notion is at complete odds with his modern worldview. The vacuousness of modernity and its accompanying immiseration is the root cause of the romantic primitivist trend in modern culture. But liberal leftists can't blame it on the culture itself, because the culture is based on the values and worldview of liberalism and leftism. And so they need to find a way to cope with that. And obviously they're too narcissistic to blame themselves, so they cope by finding a scapegoat to blame. And this, my friends, is where Marxism creeps into the equation. The anti-colonial strain of romantic primitivism is directly linked to cultural Marxism, and that is why it's so popular in all of these left-wing cultural vestiges, where a lot of these kind of red diaper baby types live and spin their webs. These are the types of people who write films like Dances with Wolves and Avatar and The Last Samurai. Their scapegoat of choice then obviously becomes exactly who you'd expect it to be. The fascist imperialist, the alpha male, the heterosexual, the European. And thus the blame for the state of modernity is shifted to us, the ones who are in complete opposition to the modern lifestyle. The liberal left has convinced themselves that if we just ceased to exist, all would be corrected and humanity would progress into some morally superior, technologically advanced, multicultural, globo-homo, Greenpeace, egalitarian utopia. They've done the mental gymnastics required to convince themselves that we are the only ones standing in the way of that reality, and thus we are the ones that must be destroyed. Their prescription for the ills of modernity? Well, the destruction of those who oppose it, even though they subconsciously know that the opposite of modernity is somehow better. There's a term used in social anthropology called cultural cringe, and it's characterized by an internalized inferiority complex that causes people to dismiss their own culture as inferior to the culture of others. It's been identified mostly by leftist social anthropologists when observing the psychology of people who have been colonized or conquered. So the kind of anti-Western, anti-white cultural cringe we see in modern Western culture is much more like a reversal of the cultural cringe idea. Modern cultural liberals and Marxists like to frame European society as inferior in all ways, morally, spiritually, physically, etc. According to their dogma, everything that makes us seemingly superior is ill-gotten, the product of our exploitation of innocent, childlike outgroups who are morally superior but powerless. So this is a purely Marxist narrative. In the modern left-wing dominated Western culture, everyone must be obsessively aware of how foreign cultures think and feel. As any true narcissist would, we must grovel to other cultures for their acceptance, even if that means overrepresenting them and portraying them as something superior to our own culture. As if cultural relativism wasn't toxic enough, the Marxist strain of anti-colonial primitivism is an even more grotesque monstrosity. It's the amalgam of Marxist xenosupremacism and the reverse cultural cringe that liberals perpetuate. And so with that said, let's now dovetail this into a little self-analysis to understand the contrast between this distinctively liberal leftist strain of romantic primitivism and the sort of romantic primitivism found in dissident right circles. There is a lot of romantic primitivism found in dissident right circles, but the reasons are very, very different. And this is pretty obvious why, and it's mostly because people on the dissident right seek to recreate a lifestyle of past peoples. The theme of archaic revival found in the dissident right movement is related to our desire for a return to more traditional, or some may even say primitive, modes of social arrangement and lifestyle. Some of us even embrace this archaic social and political revival while simultaneously embracing futuristic technologies. Guillaume Fay's book, Archaeofuturism, comes to mind when talking about this, but I think that the ideology I'm describing would be better defined as a sort of techno-reconstructionism, but I digress. We must furthermore characterize the romantic primitivism of the dissident right by its reactionary nature, that is, by its rejection of modernity, which is an actual authentic rejection, unlike the cultural lefts, which romanticizes the primitive while conveniently ignoring that their values are totally antithetical to primitivity. The values of people on the dissident right are often very traditional, if not more primitive. We are highly spiritual people, believing in many archaic belief systems and religions, including the laws of nature, which we believe to be necessary for building a harmonious society. We are also admirers of the warrior ethos and warrior cultures in general, and strive to shape ourselves in that mold. We embrace traditional masculinity, and obviously people like James Cameron are not traditional masculinists. He has said that testosterone is a toxin that needs to be worked out of our system. Such statements, and indeed feminism as a whole, are completely at odds with the primitive cultures that people like Cameron romanticize in their films. The so-called king culture that we see coming from the likes of movement leaders like Marcus Folan, aka the Golden One, is defined by a rejection of the modern Western lifestyle. Strength training, farming and eating organic foods, doing trade work, enlightening yourself with literature, rejecting degeneracy, and emulating warrior archetypes and a sort of traditional primitive mindset define this movement. We on the dissident right also believe in tribalism, identitarianism, and nationalism, which are all pre-modern ways of thinking and organizing humanity. These things are totally at odds with modern culture and the modern political paradigm. And so when we romanticize the primitive, it is wholly different and much more authentic than when the cultural left does it. We sense the emptiness and misery caused by modernity, but unlike our enemies, we have the ability to identify and reject the source of it. We have no allegiance to the values and ideological frameworks that created modernity itself, and there is nothing that emotionally or psychologically prevents us from abandoning modernity and returning to a more traditional or primitive state of existence. Our enemies, in contrast, are stuck in the prison of modernity that they created for all of us, and they keep its walls and gates intact, despite being immiserated by it, just as we are.